Pleasant greetings, y'all. Proud Filipina Charm Zespina here. I've always been fascinated by how the pillars of democracy are set up. The executive, judiciary, and the legislative, which creates the laws of the land, the judiciary, which interprets them, the executive that enforces, and the press that holds them into account. And in democracy's most famous home, the Capitol building on the hill that houses the U.S. Congress, the leader of the legislature's lower house, the speaker, is the second in line in succession of power after the vice president and concurrent Senate president. He is elected by a majority count of at least 218 votes from the 435 member representatives. And the 118th Congress that began its work in January 3rd this year did so by first electing a Speaker of the House in a rather bizarre and bruising fight amongst party mates of the GOP or Republican Party. VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson guides us through today's feature of New Congress, New Challenges.
After a bruising fight over its leadership, a new Congress takes over Capitol Hill. How will divided government impact America's direction? From immigration to defending Ukraine, now the inside story, new Congress, new challenges.
Hi, I'm Catherine Gibson, VOA's congressional correspondent here on Capitol Hill, where the new 118th Congress is trying to make its mark. Democrats managed to hold on to control of the U.S. Senate in November's elections, while Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, giving President Joe Biden a divided Congress to work with for the next 2 years. And the lengthy battle among House Republicans to choose their leader suggests any agreements with the White House will be few and far between.
So help you God.
Republican leader Kevin McCarthy emerged from a rare 4-day battle to become Speaker of the House.
The House will be in order.
Touting Republicans' accomplishments in their first full week of work.
Government should be here to help you, not to go after you. Be able to protect the unborn. We just protected the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, where the president can no longer deplete it and sell our oil to China. And we opened the House back up for the public.
But analysts say the conservative caucus that objected to McCarthy as Speaker will continue to be a problem.
He is in a weakened position, but his biggest problem is that his margin is so small. So he has only, a 5-seat margin.
Many Republicans object to resetting the nation's debt ceiling, a stance that could have global consequences if America's credit rating suffers as a result.
The American people elected Republicans to get our fiscal house in order, and get our fiscal house in order we will.
With inflation still high in the United States, Democrats have warned against government spending cuts.
These spending cuts harm families, communities throughout the U.S. that are already struggling with inflation and the cost of living.
Republicans have also launched multiple investigative committees.
Today, we will counter the Chinese Communist Party with our Select Committee on China. We will vote to protect every American's constitutional rights with the new Select Subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government.
And President Joe Biden and his family are expected to be a subject of Republican investigations, including concerning their financial transactions, despite Democrats' objections.
Instead of trying to find ways to work together, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to lean into an extreme MAGA Republican agenda, which seems to be focused on trying to investigate the president's family, not make a difference in the lives of everyday Americans.
The Biden administration's immigration policy will also come under scrutiny.
If you look at the operational goals, securing the border, securing our cyber border,
as well as billions of dollars in U.S. aid to Ukraine.
The House Republicans are are split also, but Speaker McCarthy has indicated he might side with the elements who want to, push back on funding.
But any legislation passed in the House will have to be agreed to in the Democratic majority U.S. Senate.
One flashpoint that may emerge soon is the cost of supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia's attacks. The U.S. has spent tens of billions of dollars in military, economic, and humanitarian assistance for Ukraine since Russia invaded in February 2022. But several Republicans in Congress are questioning the amount of money being spent. VOA politics and policy reporter Veronica Balderas Iglesias explains.
As Ukraine mourns the victims of the Russian missile strike in the city of Dnipro, U.S. President Joe Biden and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte decried Moscow's aggressions during a bilateral meeting in Washington.
Russia is just continuing to act in ways that are almost unbelievable. The brutality with which they're acting.
Rutte announced more support for Kyiv.
We have decided to spend another $2.5 billion on helping the Ukraine war effort. We have the intention to join what you are doing with Germany on the Patriot project, so the air defense system. I think that is important.
Also on Tuesday, circulating on Russian social networks, what looked like images of a makeshift memorial in Moscow for the Dnipro victims. At the government level, however, more promises of military might by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu.
Strengthen the combat component of the Navy, the aerospace forces, and the strategic missile forces.
Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov left the door open, however, for high-level talks between Russian officials and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William J. Burns.
It could be excluded, of course. This dialogue is useful. I don't know the exact dates.
Near Romania, meanwhile, NATO expanded the surveillance of Russia's military activities with the deployment of 3 new planes. And on the ground in Ukraine, the International Atomic Energy Agency set a permanent presence to help safeguard key nuclear facilities. Veronica Balderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
We arrived back here in Ukraine yesterday, and we're now in Lviv, in the western part of the country. Lviv is far from the war, but it is still the frequent site of attacks on infrastructure and is a main destination for internally displaced people and war wounded. This hospital specifically treats soldiers and civilians who have lost limbs, mostly from bombings and landmines, and there are hundreds of people on their waiting list. We're reporting today from Dnipro in Ukraine, and right behind me is a makeshift memorial for the more than 40 people that died in the bombing of this building on Saturday. Today we met some people who survived the bombing. One man told us that he only heard silence when the blast hit, and then he realized he was bleeding. He could then hear the screams of women and children and realized he had to go outside. Once he got outside, the situation was even more horrifying. He could see cars and his building on fire. Then, about 20 minutes after the initial blast, his building collapsed. Now he and about 300 other people are homeless. Reporting from Dnipro in Ukraine, this is Heather Murdoch, VOA News.
Republicans in the House of Representatives also have their sights set on investigating President Biden's immigration policy. Controlling the flow of migrants crossing into the U.S. from Mexico has been a challenge for decades and topped the agenda for Biden's meeting with the leaders of neighbors Mexico and Canada. VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell was in Mexico City for the summit.
Amistad, bonhomie, friendship. In all 3 languages, the leaders of Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. made a show of unity as they met Tuesday in Mexico City.
We're true partners, the 3 of us, working together with mutual respect and a genuine like for one another to advance a safer and more prosperous future for all of our people.
But the issues on the table are not as easy. Irregular migration, illegal drugs, climate change, and trade disputes are front and center, as the Mexican president pointed out as he openly challenged Biden to expand economic cooperation.
This is the moment for us to determine, to do away with this abandonment, this disdain, and this forgetfulness for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is opposed to the policy of the good neighborhood, of the titan of freedom and liberty, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and starting with you.
Biden fired back.
The United States provides more foreign aid than every other country just about combined in the world, to not just the hemisphere, but around the world. Unfortunately, our responsibility just doesn't end in the Western Hemisphere. It's in Central Europe, it's in Asia, it's in the Middle East, it's in Africa, it's in Southwest Asia.
On Tuesday, the U.S. announced a range of outcomes, which included plans to collaborate on supply chain issues and semiconductor development, modest commitments to reduce methane emissions from the solid waste and wastewater sector, and more clean energy collaboration.
Put it simply, we are, and always will be, stronger together. The world today is facing a lot of uncertainty, with the rise in authoritarian leaders causing global instability and the high cost of living putting stress on families at home. It's important that we come together as leaders and as friends to look at ways to make our economies more resilient.
Irregular migration is also a thorny issue, especially after Biden launched his trip Sunday with his first presidential visit to the busiest port of entry in the U.S., in El Paso. The leaders also reiterated their commitment to safe, orderly, and humane migration through the expansion of legal migration pathways, a range of collaborative measures, and better communication, both among one another and with the public. They also agreed that illegal trafficking in arms, drugs, and people is a shared threat, and committed to work together on the challenge. So, was this summit a success? Mexico watchers say that's a tough question.
Trilateral summits rarely yield major announcements or resolution of issues, and given that the issues that the three leaders talked about are complex and long-standing, I think it's not surprising that there was not some explosive announcement in their communique or in their press conference. But I think, having said that, the fact that they meet on a regular basis and that they identify priorities for their administrations to pursue for the coming year, I think that is important.
But as the leaders highlighted, this is a continent with great potential and great challenges. Will this summit move the needle? Time will tell. Anita Powell, VOA News, Mexico City.
More than 100 radio stations shut down last year in Venezuela under the weight of stiff government regulations and random threats of violence. Now, proposed laws to regulate social media adds to the pressure on journalists there. From Caracas, VOA's Alvaro Algara has our press freedom spotlight.
Media censorship has risen to new heights in Venezuela, with a record number of radio stations closed, even as the Venezuelan Journalists Association, CNP, documented marginally fewer physical attacks in the past 12 months.
There is a policy of censorship, prosecution of the media. Although it is true that physical aggression against journalists decreased, we saw an increase in radio station closures from 4 in 2021 to 104 in 2022.
The state communications regulator cited licensing breaches for many of the closures, and lawmakers in 2022 denied the action was related to the broadcaster's content. But Carlos Correa, director of the free expression nonprofit Espacio Público, says the moves appear to be part of a policy to limit independent media.
This year, we have documented the highest number of closures since 2001. This situation indicates that the government seems to be trying to reconfigure the ownership structure of these stations.
Adding to worries for journalists are new efforts by President Nicolás Maduro's government to reform media laws. The National Assembly is discussing proposals on regulating social media, including requiring platforms to have an in-country office to handle complaints.
We're going to regulate and control because in recent years, Venezuela has been a victim of psychological warfare through messages on social networks.
But reporters working in an already restrictive environment are wary of the plans. And Carlos Julio Rojas, an independent journalist and member of the National Press Workers Union, says pro-government supporters sometimes use social networks to generate smear campaigns against those in media.
We've seen how the Nicolás Maduro regime's dominance over communications continues to get stronger. What's their end goal? To close that last space that exists for freedom of expression?
If passed, the bill could add to Venezuela's already poor ranking on the Global Press Freedom Index, which measures the ability of journalists to work freely. The watchdog Reporters Without Borders says media there work in a restrictive environment with policies that threaten the full exercise of independent journalism. For Álvaro Algarra in Caracas, Venezuela, Veronica Villafañe, VOA News.
Threats of violence and government intimidation has many journalists fleeing Nicaragua, finding safety in neighboring Costa Rica. From its capital, San Jose, our Donaldo Hernandez shows us how a media nonprofit organization is helping those exiled journalists.
In search of protection, this group of Nicaraguan journalists arrived in Costa Rica halfway through 2022. Like many of their colleagues back home, they risked arrest or harassment by Daniel Ortega's government as it cracks down on the media and opposition voices. In the past 2 years, authorities have seized the headquarters of the historic La Prensa newspaper, prompting the entire staff to flee. Officials have also revoked the licenses of several television and radio stations. Helping the exiled journalist adjust is the Institute of Press and Freedom of Expression, or IPLEX, a Costa Rican nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting Central American journalists. Marco Barquero is project manager at IPLEX.
Our goal is to help them in their legalization process and to promote a more orderly migration for Nicaraguan journalists.
More than 150 journalists have been forced to leave Nicaragua in the past 4 years, according to the Independent Journalists and Communicators of Nicaragua collective. Marco Barquero is in close contact with many of those who recently arrived in Costa Rica.
Through all IPLEX programs, we have helped 62 Nicaraguan journalists and 1 Salvadoran journalist.
The nonprofit offers aid and temporary protection as journalists integrate into Costa Rican society. Raúl Sileski Jiménez is president of IPLEX.
The Home Refuge program covers airfare, transportation, insurance, food, shelter, internet, per diem for food and basic necessities to sustain them for a while.
For journalist Alberto Miranda, the support made a big difference. Miranda says he has been assaulted by police and threatened with arrest. He also received death threats. In 2021, he decided to leave for Costa Rica, but for the first 6 months, he could not find work.
I can tell you that this program represents an important support for Nicaraguan journalists when we arrive in Costa Rica, often in a situation of economic vulnerability.
Miranda now works for the news website Nicaragua Investiga. IPLEX wants journalists to continue their work. Media watchdog Reporters Without Borders says Nicaragua's media endure a nightmare of censorship, intimidation, and threats. But even from exile, the country's journalists work to keep news flowing. For Donaldo Hernandez in Costa Rica, Veronica Villafañe, VOA News.
For those who overcome the hurdles to enter the U.S. legally, settling into American life and finding a welcoming community can be a challenge unto itself. VOA's senior Washington correspondent Carolyn Persuti found one in an unlikely place, Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Karthik Raghunath Palanimalai is a software consultant. After he arrived in the U.S. on an L1 tech visa, he says he got no help from Colorado Springs to get settled. Instead, he relied on the city's Indian American community.
They helped me to get to the apartments and, to the work nearest to the place, and then the grocery shops or whatever things. So they really helped me for the first 3 months.
Jackie Jaramillo of Centro Balita says newcomers like Palanimalai are often invisible and isolated.
It's very difficult. There are a lot of institutional barriers, and there are cultural barriers. There's definitely racism. A lot of the immigrants that we serve are victims of crime.
That's why some found it surprising when the George W. Bush Institute ranked the city 21st out of the top 100 metro areas in the U.S. where immigrants are thriving. Colorado Springs is best known for the U.S. Air Force Academy and for Pikes Peak at 4,300 meters. The city government is largely conservative, and most Republicans are outspoken about stopping illegal border crossings.
I don't think we have a sign up that says, Colorado Springs, great place for migrants.
John Suthers is a staunch Republican and two-term mayor of Colorado Springs. In 2022, the Milken Institute ranked the city 9th in economic performance among large U.S. cities, an enticement for highly skilled authorized immigrants.
Military defense is about 40% of our economy. There's an awful lot of jobs in the related high-tech, space, cybersecurity, and things like that. And those are areas where I think a lot of our people who are migrating legally have the expertise in, and so they're looking around, why wouldn't you come to Colorado Springs?
Cullum Clark wrote the George W. Bush Institute's report, Immigrants and Opportunity in America's Cities. He says several factors were considered in the rankings list.
Is it a good place to do business, to start a company? Is it a good place to kind of get ahead career-wise? Is it a good place to afford a home?
To that, Palanimalai says yes. His new wife, who also landed a tech job, joined him in Colorado Springs, where they're enjoying the Rocky Mountain life, along with a little bit of home, like playing on the local cricket team. Carolyn Presutti, VOA News, Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an outcry for the protection of human rights has echoed throughout the global community. In its annual report, Human Rights Watch highlights a crisis that extends beyond the war in Ukraine and exists in China, Afghanistan, and Africa. Details from our Henry Ridgewell in London.
The Human Rights Watch organization says that following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the global community deserves credit for unleashing what it calls the full arsenal of the human rights system, including an investigation by the International Criminal Court.
We saw immediate responses from the international community to mobilize around key human rights supports, including establishing international justice mechanisms, evidence gathering for war crimes.
In towns like Bucha and Izium, there is widespread evidence that occupying Russian soldiers tortured, raped and executed civilians. The United Nations Human Rights Council has documented several hundred civilian killings, thought to be a fraction of the total.
In some cases, Russian soldiers executed civilians in makeshift places of detention. Others were summarily executed on the spot, following security checks in their houses, yards, and doorways.
Human Rights Watch's annual report also highlights ongoing abuses in China, including the mass detention, torture, and forced labor of as many as 1 million Muslims in the Xinjiang region. Beijing denies the accusations. The report says the UN Human Rights Council's increased scrutiny of Beijing's actions is encouraging.
What we have seen for the first time in a very long time is cracks in the authoritarian armor.
In Iran, protests triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini after she was detained by morality police have grown into nationwide anti-government demonstrations. Human Rights Watch says the execution of at least 4 protesters must trigger a stronger global response.
We need to move beyond international solidarity for protesters and need to make sure that governments all over the world are holding Iranian officials to account.
The report cites increasing human rights abuses in Myanmar, where the authors say the regime is launching assaults on communities across the country that oppose the military coup. In Ethiopia, Human Rights Watch says the recent African Union-led peace process has resulted in a fragile truce.
Ensuring that there is accountability for the egregious crimes that took place in the Tigray region, for example, is going to be critical for this ceasefire and this truce to actually hold.
The report says climate change is having an increasing impact on basic rights worldwide. It says governments have a legal and moral obligation to regulate industries such as fossil fuel extraction that are incompatible with protecting basic rights. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
That's all we have for now. Stay up to date at voanews.com and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News. Follow me on Twitter at KGYP and catch up on past episodes at our free streaming service, VOA Plus. I'm Katherine Gibson. We'll see you next week for the Inside Story.
And that's a wrap for today. We hope you enjoyed today as much as we did. We look forward to you joining us for the next Inside Story offering. And here's reminding you all to work hard and dream big. Count those blessings and be kind, and catch the news right here. This is Sharm Zespina for Stories from the Grid.